Hey guys, and welcome to the second installment of Updated Builds, a playlist where I go back over Warframes that I already made one or more build videos for and I bring them up to date, because most of them are very old and horrifically out of date. Now I asked you which Warframe you would like to see next at the end of the previous video, and the one that seemed to be the most popular in at least the first couple of hours was Saryn, so we're doing Saryn today. But before we jump into the builds, I would just like to remind you that these are builds that I personally enjoy. They are not necessarily the best min-maxy sort of builds. I simply enjoy builds that work well, that feel good, and that are effective at what they were designed to do. I'm just not that kind of person that will play a build just because it's strong, even though it's kind of a pain in the ass to play with. Understood? Fantastic. So the builds I have prepared for you today are, first of all, a sports build that's very straightforward, very effective, though not very flexible, and it's fantastic for either farming focus or just speeding through defense missions. It's also really good for group play because you have a lot of range and damage. Then I have a Toxic Lash build, which is sort of my take on the melee Saryn dealio. This one adds a ton of damage to your melee weapon and makes you pretty beefy as well. And finally I have a Miasma build, which is sort of a fun little setup that I put together, and I love to use this one for simply fuffing around the star chart. And let's kick it off with build number 1, which focuses on spores. The ore I'm using here is corrosive projection, which is absolutely fantastic for a setup like this because the vast majority of damage we do is heavily diminished by armor, so reducing the enemy armor is the best thing we can do here. Now this build is very power hungry, so we need either flow or the primed version of flow to give us a bigger energy reserve so we can bank some energy to then do damage with. This is a caster, so you want to use abilities all the time, which is also why I'm using Streamline, which kind of balances out Blind Rage, and the reason I'm not using Fleeting Expertise here is because that would completely kill my power duration, which is also important on this setup. I'm then using Stretch and Overextended to get as much range as possible, and this is to spread our spores as far as we can. Though it kind of depends on whether or not you want to specialize this setup. If for example you just want to run Hydron, you don't need this much range. I then decided to use all 4 power strength mods, so Power Drift, Intensify, Transient Fortitude and Blind Rage to get as much power strength as I can so my spores do as much damage as they can, and I felt this was necessary because I'm also using Overextended, which lowers your power strength quite a bit. It's mostly because the damage felt kind of meh with just 3 of them in higher level missions, and finally I'm using Vitality because even though most of the time the enemies won't make it anywhere near you if you're popping spores left, right and center, every now and then a sneaky Eximus unit or a Bombard will make it past everything and shotgun or bombard you in the face. Now this setup was designed to be used in sort of a controlled environment, so something like Hydron, a place where you can anchor yourself down and do the same thing over and over and over again until the mission is over. And what you want to do with this setup is find a nice spot, plop down your mold, throw a couple of spores on the mold, and then you kind of have 3 options that you have to choose between depending on the situation you are in. If you're out of energy once you use the spores, you simply want to shoot them with one of your weapons. If you have a ton of energy and you want to do some extra damage, you want to use Miasma, which will detonate the mold and do a ton of damage to everything on the map. And finally, if you have some energy but you would like to get more, you want to use Toxic Lash and hit the spores with your melee weapon, which will spread them around and give you some energy back for each infected enemy. Now there is one more thing you could do, which is simply recast mold, which will detonate the old one and pop all the spores, but this doesn't really give you any benefit. Now I wouldn't really recommend using this setup in stuff like Exterminate, Capture or basically all non-endless missions because it's far too power hungry and you're gonna spend most of the mission out of energy. But you can easily take this into defense, survival, interception or even mobile defense missions. It just doesn't work very well if you constantly have to move from one place to another, so the best thing you can do is bunker yourself in 1 or 2 rooms and then kill everything that comes anywhere near them. And finally, if you find yourself in a situation where you can't really pull off the whole combo, so mold, spores, lash, smack, you can just throw the spores on an enemy and shoot them a couple of times. It's better than doing nothing. The second build on the menu today is my Toxic Lash setup, and this one starts off with Energy Siphon as our aura. Now you ideally want to use Theo Charge so you get more melee damage, but I have 2 other builds and they are both using a dash, though it's not too bad because at least you get more energy for using Molt. Then for my Exile slot, I'm using Aviator, and this is mostly because the build feels pretty squishy for a melee build, and I like to use Sigma and Octantis a lot, which means I'm gonna be in the air a lot to throw the shield. It's just nice to have an additional layer of defense on this setup. Then I'm using Streamline to kind of counteract Blind Rage, because without it, both Toxic Lash and Molt, which we are using with Regenerative Mod, are absurdly expensive. We are talking in the hundreds, so you wouldn't be able to use too many abilities without this. I'm then using Prime Continuity to give myself some power duration to increase the duration of Toxic Lash, so I don't have to recast it as often. It also increases the duration of Mold, though that doesn't really matter because we're mostly going to use Mold in higher level missions where it's going to get exploded anyways. I then had to add Regenerative Mold, which makes it so that when you place down Mold, it will heal you over time, and I had to use this because I was running into some issues of the dying variety, especially when I was going up against higher levels. Then I'm running Vitality and Steel Fiber for some extra beefiness, because if you don't have any defensive mods outside of Regenerative Mold, you're just gonna get one shot. And finally, to get a massive damage bonus from Toxic Lash and to also get decent healing from Regenerative Mold, I am running Transient Fortitude, I'm running Blind Rage, that's 2 ranks from the top to avoid efficiency issues, and Intensify. It's quite surprising how much damage Toxic Lash can actually add once you have enough power strength. As you can see over here, on the left we have my standard Guandao setup, and on the right we have the same setup but with Toxic Lash active, and we're fighting a level 135 heavy gunner. The extra damage from Toxic Lash is definitely noticeable, and there really isn't much else to say about this. It's just a melee setup. You pop Toxic Lash, you smack a bunch of dudes around with your melee weapon, and you use Regenerative Mold as an on-demand heal. I personally don't use this setup too much though, because for the way I like to play melee, this setup is just way too squishy. I play like a cannonball. I will jump into the middle of an enemy group and start flailing around, and this setup just cannot take that at high levels. Though I must say it is absolutely fantastic for boosting the power of my Windmill Guandao. You can really feel the extra damage coming in. But please don't be discouraged by this, because it's still a fantastic melee setup that adds a ton of damage and has an on-demand heal. So if you're either not as reckless as me when it comes to melee, or you simply take it into lower level missions and you faff around the star chart with it, you're gonna be absolutely fine. And the final setup we're going to check out today is the Miasma build, which is a build that I've put together just to have fun, and it's essentially a more mobile and frantic version of the Spore build. And it's designed to give you as much energy and efficiency as possible, so you can just go ham with abilities. So of course we are running Energy Siphon, which gives us extra energy. Then I'm using Freaking Expertise to give myself a ton of efficiency so I can just use abilities willy-nilly. I'm using Stretch and Cunning Drift for power range, and the reason I'm using Cunning Drift here is because Stretch didn't feel like it was giving me enough power range. It was a little bit too short, and I didn't want to go for overextended because that would completely butcher my strength. And then I have Vitality and Gladiator Resolve, which gives me a lot of health, and that goes really well with Hunter Adrenaline, which converts 45% of damage dealt to your health into energy, so more energy for more frantic casting. And finally we need some power strength, because otherwise we're not gonna do any damage, so I'm running Transient Fortitude, Intensify, and Power Drift. Now the way you're gonna play with this kind of depends on the level of enemies you're fighting. If you're fighting low level enemies, you can just spam Miasma and it should one-shot everything. So in low levels at least, it is kind of similar to the old school Saryn. But once the enemies get to sort of level 30 and above, you will have to start comboing things together. And the way I like to do it with this setup is I simply throw spores at a nearby enemy, then I shoot them with something like the Hema to spread the spores around, and then I pop Miasma for massive damage. So there you go, those are the 3 builds on Saryn that I will switch in between based on what I'm doing. They will of course work on the regular Saryn as well, they will just require a little bit more format. And speaking about format, the way you want to do things is simply put on all the mods, and if they don't fit, pick the mod with the highest capacity drain, format for that, and do that until you can fit everything in. And as always guys, I thank you very much for watching. You can let me know which Warframe you would like to see next in the comment section down below, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.